thoroughly. Normally we would have had the Sunday on modern Islamic state, modern Islamic state next week. But since Dr. Gowher Rizvi leaves tomorrow for Bhutan, he wouldn't be around next week, and he graciously agreed to talk with us today. I won't repeat what is on the paper about his background, except to say two things. One, by the accident of the division of Pakistan, Gowher Rizvi not only was a Rhodes Scholar, but the only Rhodes Scholar from Bangladesh, because Bangladesh doesn't have a quota of Rhodes, as I understand it. That's right. Yeah. And having gone as a student to Oxford, he did stay in a series of tenured appointments until 1994. Since when he's been in this country, during a somewhat turbulent period, he's with the Asian Society for a while. And what I'm delighted in is to discover that the new title that he assumed a month ago is Deputy Director of Governance and Civil Society at the Ford Foundation. Dr. Gowher Rizvi.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Good morning, and Phil, thank you very, very much for asking me this morning. It's indeed a tremendous pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of my very tentative and preliminary thoughts. I will apologize to you if my thoughts are somewhat incoherent, because I did this in a little bit of a hurry and did not think through some of the things very, very clearly. It is today commonplace all over to treat Islam and the Islamic world as a monolithic entity. In a sense, when we talk of Islam, we see them as one undifferentiated entity or a system or a group of people who all behave alike. But of course, in view of some of the things I'm going to say in a moment, it would be good to make sure that we have a somewhat differentiated picture of Islam. But to say that Islam is differentiated, and as I will continue to argue throughout that it is a differentiated group, it is not to deny that there is an essential unity in Islam as well. And that unity of Islam is really, really most striking. As you will have probably heard last week, the concept of ummah, or the community of the faithful, as the Muslims like to view themselves, is truly very real. Today, Muslims are scattered all over the world, but there is that notion of ummah, or this community of faithful, which does create links and bonds which are truly most remarkable. This bond, this linkage is not only based on the 5 principles or the 5 pillars of Islam, which I believe you might have spoken last week, the belief in the unity of God, in the finality of Prophet Muhammad, in prayers 5 times a day, performing pilgrimage, and of course jihad. Jihad, which mainly translated as a holy war, which is nothing of that sort. We may come back to it if you like, because I think the notion of jihad is extraordinarily important in the Islamic world, and I'll be glad to come back to it if an opportunity gives up. So that creates a affinity. But there is, beyond the religion, there is also another affinity. And it is most striking, no matter wherever Muslims come together, irrespective of their race, ethnicity, language, nationality, Muslims do share a sense of brotherhood, which transcends many other divisions which keeps them apart. So to that extent, I think Islam is not entirely a mistaken thing to think of it as a unity. However, there is also extraordinary diversity, extraordinary heterogeneity amongst the Muslims of the world. Muslims today, it's difficult to say how many Muslims there are. It varies between 800 million to 1 billion, variously estimated. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were 44 Muslim countries, meaning countries where Muslims were a majority. If you include the 5 Central Asian republics, which are all Muslim majority or nearly Muslim majority, the number is around 49. They are scattered over 5 continents. They speak as many languages as there are countries. And there is nothing which really would suggest to you that there is an a priori reason for believing that the Muslims of this diverse world have a shared interest or view, or that they are separate or distinct from the fellow country people with whom they live and they exist. In fact, it is far from that. There are 2 very strong Islamic traditions, which means that the Muslims are very much of the part of the society in which they live. And that is why, despite every effort, and what I said earlier on about the unity of the Ummah, they are as divisive and as split as you can imagine. The first reason why Islam is so diverse is what is, for want of a better word, known as the Syncretic traditions, in the sense that Islam, unlike many other faiths, does not have an active proselytization movement. In other words, even though Islam has spread in vast parts of the world, it has not been followed or it has not been backed up by an effective proselytization. In other words, what this means is that wherever Muslims have come in large number through conversion mainly, they have adopted the culture, the tradition, the dietary habits, the dressing habits of the indigenous people. So in most of the world, when you go and you travel and you meet Muslims, it would be very, very difficult to distinguish them from their next door neighbors. This is true for Bengal, where I grew up. This is true for Indonesia. This is true for southern Philippines. Wherever you go, people are very much rooted in the soil and draw their inspiration. And Islam takes the local coloring. So, for instance, in Bengal, the vast majority of the Muslims are converts from Hindus, and they have actually brought with them all the Hindu practices, cultures, habits, superstitions, including some of their caste differentiation, despite the strong abhorrence in Islam for caste notion, into their popular belief. Now, of course, the extreme puritanical Muslims would consider this to be heretical, but to my mind, this is the greatest strength of Islam, to become a part of the local milieu. And the second important reason why Islam is so diverse is the great Sufi tradition. Of course, there is no doubt, if you look at the history of the expansion of Islam, you will notice that sword has played an important part in spreading Christianity, and there is no 2 opinions about it. In the early part, Islam came as the religion of the conquerors, and to that extent, force was very much present there. But if you look in terms of numbers of converts that were brought to Islam, they were not brought by sword, they were brought by great Sufi scholars who were in fact the most ultimate proponent of syncretist tradition. The Sufis, with their belief that all roads lead to the same God, made Islam a much more tolerant religion, in which there was place for everybody and there was no discrimination. And this, of course, enabled for Islam to get many more converts. And today, It is one of the main reasons why you have as many faces of Islam as there are Muslim countries. And I think this is an important fact to remember, because it is the failure to differentiate Islam. It is the failure to recognize that what we see today, the popular image of Islam, that of anger, of destruction, of terrorism, of hijacking, of bloodthirsty fanatics, is but a small minority in that large Islamic community. Bulk of the people are not, and yet these get reported as the only dominant image of Islam. But to say that this is not the dominant view of Islam is not to deny that there is truly today a great fervor, great upheaval in the Islamic society. Islam, no matter where it is today, Muslims, no matter where they live today, whether in Muslim majority countries or in countries where they are a minority, they are in an upheaval. There is a turmoil. There is self-questioning going on, and has been going on for the last quarter of a century as seldom before. And I think what I would like to talk about is what is this turmoil in the contemporary Islamic society, and then we can open it up. But before I go on to that, let me make two further points. First thing is to argue that Muslim states are not Islamic states. There are, if my reckoning is correct, 49 Muslim states. There are only 2 Islamic states. The 2 Islamic states being Iran and Saudi Arabia. The rest of them sometimes call themselves Islamic Republic of Pakistan, but they are not theocratic state based on Islamic principles or based on Quranic governance as Iran and Saudi Arabia claims to be. There are attempts, there are pretensions of being Islamic, but there is a large gap. The reason for saying and emphasizing this is to say that the failings of Muslim society are not the failings of Islam. One needs to make that important distinction. There's a second important thing to bear in mind, that within Islamic society there are different, we tend to describe everybody as Islamist, but within Islam there are several distinctive trends, and in many of these Islamic countries there is a tussle, there is a fight going on between different Islamic groups. Broadly speaking, there are those whom I would, for want of better word, call the obscurantists, who would turn their back on progress, who would turn their back on the last 1500 years of evolution and try to go back to a very narrowly defined way, the sort of things that we are today witnessing under the Taliban in Afghanistan, where they are taking women out of schools, sending women out of the streets, etc. Partly you see that in Saudi Arabia as well. But that the Muslims are in fact fighting against their own obscurantists. Then there are the other group who are reformers, who are trying to revive, the Muslim revival, Islamic revivalists, who are trying to reform and strengthen their own society through appeal to Islamic way of life, to which again I shall come back in a moment. Now, as I said, the main question to ask ourselves today is, why is the Islamic, or I was going to go against what I said myself, why is the Muslim world today in such a state of turmoil? Now, this is a point which is often made, but I think it is well worth making. If you want to understand the Islamic psyche, if you want to understand why Muslims today feel the way they are feeling, it is important to go back to their history. And really, history in some ways, Muslims are captives of their history, and struggle as they may, they are unable to break away from it, and some rather real and important reason. The first important historical factor, what might be described as the Andalus, or in the Arabic Andalus syndrome, is if you have been to Cordova in Spain, you will appreciate this very, very readily, where some of the finest Islamic architecture, mosques and buildings survive intact, but there are no Muslims around. They were driven out. And there is this fear, the Andalus syndrome, that Muslims may become extinct. They may, the history has shown to them that despite their enormous historical past, despite their first 700-800 years of enormous success, they have nosedived from about 1450 onwards, and this is almost an irreversible process. What happened in Andalus will happen elsewhere. Now, argue as you will, Muslims fear this, and this fear of history often makes them react what is perhaps seen as irrational. The second, and by far the most important and real reason in the minds of the Muslim, is the impact of European colonialism, impact of Western imperialism on Islamic countries. If you look at the map of the world in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you will be struck that all the Muslim countries, barring Turkey and Iran, Iran, in a very precarious way, all the Muslim countries had come under European colonial rule. And this is a factor of great anxiety, because not only imperialism, whether it is Islamic society or non-Islamic society, tried to recreate the colonies in its own image of a European Christian image. But in the case of the Muslims, there was a tremendous clash, because the Muslims, unlike other communities, felt most threatened, and therefore reacted in a most vigorous and often in violent manner. And that is a fact which lives with them day to day. Imperialism, or the experience of Western imperialism, is not a phase in the life of a Muslim, a phase in the past which came and went. It is very much today with them, lives with them, and continues to shape their outlook. And what is more important, and this is, I think, the most important thing to bear in mind, end of formal imperialism, formal colonialism, did not end the Muslim agony. And this is where I think a lot of people have misunderstood that, or if not misunderstood, the key or the clue to understanding the turmoil is to recognize that the Muslims do not feel that their agony has ended with the end of colonial rule. Why do I say this? The reason for that is that with the end of the colonial rule, power was transferred to a highly westernized elite, highly people who drew their inspiration, who had all but become European, but for their local indigenous origins. As the British Lord Trevelyan remarked, Indians had become European, but for their brown skins. Apart from that, now it was to these elites that power was transferred. And what you find immediately after the colonial, although the external ruler extricated itself, withdrew from power, it transferred to an elite which turned out to be far more exploitative, far more indifferent, far more antagonistic and remote from the indigenous population than perhaps its predecessor. Because the rule of the European was a much lighter rule, in the sense that they never had the capacity or the power or the institutions to penetrate into all levels of society. The successors did, and without in any way being able to identify. And so what you see is Western rule replaced by westernized elites, alien ideology, the ideology that these westernized rulers espoused were very different from those of the indigenous people. So we tried all the isms of the world, socialism, communism, capitalism, Marxism, you name it, which were which were not rooted in the society in which these were being tried. And also, of course, the new regimes failed to meet the aspirations of the people. So what happened was, once the colonial rulers pulled out, the struggle has continued. And if you look at the upheavals in the Muslim world today, you will see a lot of these is rooted very much in that continuation of that conflict. And again, another interesting phenomenon to recognize is, as I said, although there are large groups of obscurantists who have their own agenda, but the so-called Islamist movement, and very often the Islamist movements are hijacked by obscurantists. The Islamist movements are led by professional people, people educated in the Western tradition, engineers, academics, philosophers, who are leading their country, who are in the forefront of the Islamic movement, whether it is in Egypt, whether it was in Iran before Imam Khomeini's section got hold of the movement. If you look at Ali Shariati's teachings, which provided the essential ingredients for the Islamic revolution in Iran, these were highly secular, where they were trying to evolve an alternative society based on indigenous values, based on indigenous customs, keeping the elements of modernization, but not of westernization. Again, we can talk about westernization and modernization, if you like, in that question. And the final point I want to make, again, I will not develop because my time is running out, is that this struggle, the turmoil, is largely, I would like to have used the word exclusively, but certainly largely internal and domestic. The Muslims are fighting amongst themselves with their rulers. They're trying to reshape their society. This is not anti-Western. The tirade, the hostility of the Muslims are not against the West, even though, I must quickly admit, very often it takes an anti-Western shape. And the reason for that, again, if you try to pause for a moment to think about it, you will see it is not because there is anything inherently anti-Western in the Islamic thought or Islamic way of life or Islamic religion. There is no fundamental conflict there. What happens is when people see that the rulers who are oppressing them, rulers who are alien to them, who are being propped up, held up, supported by external powers, that domestic animosity then turns against the external supporter, backer of the regime. So I think this is a very, very important point. Again, I haven't got the time to develop it, but if you would like me to come back to this, I'll be very happy to illustrate this with examples and with more elaboration. Thank you very much.
Food for thought and food for questions. Why don't you take your own question?
Please.
I think you better take someone else's first one.
Please.
You
used a lot of words that were foreign to me, which seem to be key to what you said. Ulam, for example.
Ummah.
Obscurantists and Islam versus Muslim. I always thought those were exactly the same. Would you, spell those words and
Okay.
give a short definition?
Right. Ummah is spelled U-M-M-A. And the translation would be, from a Muslim point of view, the community of the faithfuls. In other words, those who believe in Islam. And this community transcends nationality. In fact, there is a strong tension between Islam and nationalism. And again, if one goes back, and one of the reasons why Western imperialism is such a nightmare for Islamic world is nationalism is a imported ideology which was imposed, and Muslims feel that this was done, and that's with some justification, done to split them deliberately from each other. So the concept, the notion of Islam, Ummah, is very much alive. However, increasingly Muslims now recognize that nation states, or states, it's far from nation states as yet, are still are a reality with which they must come to terms, even though they find it difficult. And if you are traveling in the Middle East, you can see how hard it is for all the Arab-speaking countries to define or explain their separate nationality. So that's the point I was making. The second thing about Islam and Muslims, I think there is an important reason, important thing. Let me try to explain this and then perhaps give you a flippant example. Islam is a very distinctive way of life which Muslims are aspiring to achieve. Muslims have not yet achieved. And that is why we as Muslims would argue that, that some of the excesses, the intolerance that you see in us is our failings as Muslims. These are not enjoined on us by our religion. So, in a sense, we are still striving, and that is why I had mentioned the word jihad and said this is something we might want to talk about. Today, the moment the word jihad is uttered, it means a holy war. Jihad has never meant the holy war. Jihad means striving towards perfection, striving towards improvement. So you as a Muslim, it is my jihad to be a better human being. That is the constant striving. Now, if in my striving I also have to fight a war or a battle, so be it. But it is a constant individual and societal endeavor at improvement. Now, the reason why I say, and this is to answer your second part of your question, why I say we must separate, make a distinction between Muslim and Islam is because outsiders, when a group of terrorists do something outrageous, it is immediately said they are Islamic terrorists. Now let me give you one example of one evening when the bombing in Oklahoma took place, the very ghastly bombing. There was early part, for understandable reason, there was a suspicion that it was some Middle Eastern group. And the phrase that was being used is Islamic militants may have done it. Later that evening, it became clear that some Christian youth might have been responsible for it. And it immediately became an extremist militia. It was no longer Christian extremism or fundamentalism. So what I'm trying to say is, our failings become Islamic. Likewise, when we talk about the nuclear bomb, many countries have developed, acquired nuclear weapons. This is not a justification for you, just a statement of fact. But when Pakistan attempted to build a nuclear bomb, it was the only country which had a religious bomb. It became the Islamic bomb. This might be, as I said, a flippant example to give you, but there's a deeper problem there which needs to be separated.
What obscurantists was another one.
Right. So obscurantists, what I'm basically saying, there are, within the Islamic groups, within the Islamic movement, there are some extremely retrograde, reactionary, backward-looking people who would like to see, as they gave the example of the Taliban in Afghanistan, who think it is Islamic to take women out of schools. Now, I would challenge any Taliban to show me where does Islam sanction that women should not be educated. And on the other hand, if you look at most Muslim societies, one of the major effort has been to educate women. And if they were neglected, if education was neglected of the women, it was not because of Islam, it was because of social neglect. So that's, but Muslim reformers are having to fight the ulama or the mullahs who are obscurantists, who are reactionary, and who are trying to stem progress. And my point is, the conflict in Islam is not with progress or modernization or development, but perhaps with, adopting blindly a Western style way of life.
Are you ready now?
Thank you. I'll try again. I would expect that Islam would have an anti-Western bias because it seems to me that the perception of the Western world and culture right now, seen from outside, that we are really ungodly and so radically secular that I would think that a religious-based society would have an anti-bias.
I think there may be some truth in what you are saying, but I'm not sure if this is in the mainstream of the Islamic thought. Now, let me go one stage back. Islam has been in conflict with all the major religions of the world, historically. It has been in conflict for almost 1,000 years with Christianity, Judaism, and later on for another 1,000 years with Hinduism. In other words, see, Islam displaced, conquered, expanded. To that extent, there is a conflict. And so there is a reservoir of historical memories in everybody. So anything that now happens, we instantly go. I remember there was a story of the immigrants in one of the British newspapers. Some Muslims from Kashmir had come, and instantly the parallel was drawn to the Muslims in the gates of Vienna in 1400 something. So there is a historical reservoir. But you see, one of the things which Islamic reformers are also doing today is precisely the sort of thing that they don't like in the West, they also don't like in their own people, in their own leaders. Everything that you described, what Muslim might think about a Western world, is precisely the sort of thing I was saying, the conflict that is going on in the society, within our own society. So we are at as much, if not as much, in fact far more at loggerheads with our own leaders, our own society, than with the West. There isn't. In fact, when it comes to doctrinal questions, religious questions, I am absolutely staggered how alike we are. We went to a dinner, I think it was Yom Kippur dinner recently, and there a passage was read from the Torah. Word for word, sentence for sentence, para for para, it could have come out of the Quran. You know, it is so, there is, at a religious level, there is no really distinction. So that is why there is no built-in antagonism. It may happen, it may develop. Thank you.
I don't think this should surprise us, stereotypes and things go on. When you look at like two Christians, the Irish, for instance, who've been battling each other, they're the same, in essence, both Christians, but been killing each other for years. I mean, it just seems to be something that we've got to get out of our psyche, to stereotype a whole, whether it's a country or a whole religion or anything. I think that's the important thing we've got to look at. These are individuals. If you look at the basis of their religion, it's very common to ours.
Exactly, except that you have resolved through 100 years of war and 30 years of war and the Treaty of Westphalia and the Treaty of Utrecht resolved some of these problems. As Muslims, we have just beginning to address some. I hope it will not take that long. Sorry.
Could you say a word or two about the situation of Islam in Turkey today?
I think, I don't know, I'm no expert on Turkey, so if anybody else is, please do come in. Turkey, under Kemal Atatürk, went through a very rapid phase of so-called modernization, which in large part was westernization. They adopted Western clothes, Western English script, and a lot of superficial trappings that come with modernization. I'm really, really not sure how deep that has penetrated into the society. So the result is you do see a lot of tensions. Series of strong authoritarian governments, first Atatürk himself, later a series of military rulers or military-backed regimes did manage to keep order. And I would say, insofar as any Islamic society has advanced towards a secular way of life, probably Turkey has gone the furthest. But I would still say it is very, very superficial, and what we are seeing today, the Islamic governance, is not uncommon. Now, Turkey has not suffered a serious setback. There was another country we could have said the same thing prior to 1979. Iran was one step behind Turkey. Reza Shah Pahlavi I had copied Atatürk, gone the same way. But again, I don't think those Western trappings penetrated very deeply. The third society which did the same thing was Afghanistan. King Amanullah tried to do the same thing. Now, in the scale, I would think Afghanistan is furthest away than any. So there is a problem. I don't know the full answer to Turkey, but my sense is there is a lot more to be resolved before we will see stability there.
Is there anything you would call persecution of the Muslims by the Turkish government?
Not now. You see, those were reversed. About 15 years ago or 10 years ago, things started being reversed. Madrasas which had been shut were reopened. Government support for clergy which had been withdrawn had been reinstated. So I cannot think of persecution of Muslims by Turkish government, except that people may have felt offended that their personal preferences were being given. But I honestly don't know enough about Turkey.
Unless you refer to the Turkish Kurds.
Exactly, yes, certainly. But again, I'm not sure if it is religion or ethnicity. The basis which the Kurds distinguish themselves from the Turks is not based on religion, rather their ethnicity. Yes, please. Mildred, and then please.
I just wanted, excuse me, more a statement than a question, and you've heard me say this before. We all know at international conferences that that some of the Muslim representatives there, particularly the men, are the most against any reforms or liberalism for women. And in Pakistan, I heard a male scholar, Islamic scholar, make the following statement, and this is what I wanted to say. He said that what is needed is a fresh translation of the Quran, which he says is one of the world's most liberal religious documents, a fresh interpretation by a woman, then interpretation by women, in order, and I'm quoting him precisely, in order to remove the garbage that has been dumped on it through the centuries by the mullahs to their own advantage. And this is what the Muslim women are fighting for.
I think you are absolutely right. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, here, at the risk of being called a heretic, let me say, I would not disclaim being a believer. I think I'm a believer. But Quran was recorded 2 generations after the death of the Prophet. Now, while as a believer, I have no difficulties in thinking that it is a revealed religion, a revealed book, but I do also believe in human infallibility, and I do think that a Quran may not have been recorded as it was revealed. So the idea is absolute. And I think part of the Islamic resurgence is all about this. And if you look at the instance of Malaysia, women are in the forefront of Islamic resurgence, Islamic revivalism. And they are, in the West, literature, politics, sociology, all benefited when they were given a gender lens. Why shouldn't Quran or Islam benefit? Certainly, sir, there and there.
Wasn't his wife the first Muslim?
Who?
Wasn't Muhammad's wife the first convert?
Phil might know the answer. The reason for my hesitation, I think Ali, his son-in-law, may have been the first, but I wouldn't know.
Neither is discussed.
And for his time, judging him at his time, he was a radical feminist. He brought certain reforms for his time that were far, at least that's my belief.
You are absolutely right, sir. I mean, there is no doubt, and that is the point. I think if you look at the Quran and the teachings in the spirit in which it came, then none of these problems that, we are talking of the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic period, where women were treated as properties. Sons inherited mothers. So, we are talking of that society where women were made equal, given property rights, given the right to make decision, given the right to be an important part of the society. Now, you are starting from that base and going that far. It was certainly revolutionary, and to that extent, many Muslim women feel that what the last 1400 years has done is try to hold them back the emancipation that had started 1400 or so years ago.
Does our strong support of Israel color our relations with Muslim countries?
Sorry?
Does our strong support of Israel color our relationship with Muslim countries?
Yeah. Yes. I would make agree with you, but let me make a slight distinction. Anti-Semitism in Islam is almost unknown. I mean, the sort of anti-Semitic feelings that you see in Europe, there is no tradition of that. In fact, Muslims and Jews consider themselves as first cousins. So there is no anti-Jewish sentiments in Islam. But certainly, the cause of the Palestinians is very popular. The fact that the state of Israel was, as viewed by the Muslims, created and planted there, and the world has ignored the plight. And if you look at some of the early instances of hijacking, terrorism, where there's a cry for help. How do we make our voices heard? I'm not saying that is the way to do it, but at least that is the way it was perceived to have been. So to that extent, you are right. I think the inability to recognize Muslim perspective or Muslim Arab feelings, in this case Arabs, I don't think an Indonesian Muslim is that involved, was certainly a factor. Sir.
I don't know whether this is within the purview of your lecture, but I seem to have gathered that there is a connection between all of the doctrines that we recognize, such as Christianity and Judaism, etc., that have a component of obscurantism. And I'm not sure I know what that noun means. I think the verb is to obscure. Could you make it a little more clear? Oh, second question. Is there an emotional component to obscurantism that you could?
Without trying to dodge the question, I honestly am not competent to talk about other religions, and not even about Islam as a religion. My knowledge about Islam as a religion, I'm more of a scholar of politics and international relations then. But I think you are right again. I think there are obscurantists and people whom we call fundamentalists in every religion, every society. And for a whole variety, if you look without exception, if you look in India today, the Hindu fundamentalists, there's a resurgence of Hindu fundamentalists. In Israel, the Jewish fundamentalists, there's a resurgence. In North America, Europe, Christian fundamentalists. So it is, and to an extent, again, these are my problem, my discomfort is the use of labels, because the labels mean say nothing but imply a lot, and so I'm uncomfortable with the use of the word fundamentalists, etc. And I apologize for using the word obscurantist, but I was using it as a shorthand to refer to the retrograde reactionary elements in the society. But you are right. This transcends all religion, except that amongst the Muslims this is a very vibrant issue, and Muslims will have to resolve this hopefully soon. Sorry, I'll come to you in a moment.
Yes, I've read, I guess, different reports about the relationship of Islam or Muslims and the concept of slavery and the practice of slavery, particularly in Africa in 100, 200 years ago. Is there some clarification you can add to that as to what that relationship is? I know, obviously, 1,000 years ago, slavery was accepted, and how has that developed within Islam?
Right. Let me, again, there are a lot of issues, like on the status of women, which we were talking earlier, on slavery. Quran is contradictory. Quran was revealed in stages in response to certain set of social compelling problems. Now, at the time when Islam was trying to consolidate itself around Mecca, Medina, in the Saudi Arabia, Quran generously allows you to take slaves. Slaves are very much, you are allowed, just as you are allowed to take the women of the people you conquer, you are also allowed to take slaves. But if you go further down along the road, some of the great virtues, what is a good Muslim, the virtues of a good Muslim that are being discussed: piety, charity, honesty. Freeing the slaves is considered as one of the highest virtues and your surest way of attaining a place in heaven. is to free the slaves. So that's why one could say that Islam sanctioned slavery. One would also argue Islam placed a high premium on the emancipation of slavery.
If you take a country such as Algeria, you've got the colonialism, you've got the adaptation of the culture you were talking about, you've got the conflict with the elites, but you also have a tremendous population explosion, which occurs elsewhere. You get an average age in the 20s, tremendous frictions because of unemployment, and this seems to be a general problem in population control.
Yes. I think you are absolutely right. Population problems of economic deprivation, age imbalance, these are all serious problems because different generations cannot communicate with each other. But I would not treat that as an Islamic problem. Bangladesh is a Muslim country. Today, Bangladesh, about 10 years ago, had one of the highest birth rates in the world. Today, it is probably amongst the developing countries at one of the lowest end. Now, it is a Muslim country. In 10 years, this dramatic change has happened. So the point I'm trying to make is, this is much more a problem of policy, problem of effort, and not necessarily confined to religion. People in the past would say, government cannot do because it is a very sensitive area. Well, governments did. Nobody created a problem. And if you remember, a few years ago, when we were clamoring all over the developing countries that give us more aid so that we can curb our population, there was a government in this country which said, we'll cut off your aid if this is applied to controlling population. Thank you.
I'm afraid that must be the last.
We're all slaves here, slaves of the clock. And once again, the clock has cut us off much earlier than we might have stopped if we were able to pursue. I want to thank Gowher Rizvi on two counts. One, for coming as a good friend to be with us this morning, just less than 24 hours before he has to go halfway around the world. We do appreciate very much. But second, for a highly articulate, well-elaborated statement, which gives more dimensions, I think, to our understanding of Islam in the current world. Gowher, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Are all subject